Hey, welcome to another episode of the Rematriating Borikén Podcast. Last episode was Leaving NYC. This episode will be reflections on the arrival to Boriken. Last week we celebrated our 10-year anniversary here in Boriken. Wanted to start with some written reflections, some journal entries, written reflections, and then deeper thoughts and memories on that arrival that happened May 15, 2014. Before I get started, I just wanted to share that I am coming up for some breath on this full moon because I have been diligently and deeply working in my cave, finalizing this first wave of the Rematriating Borikén portraits. I call the series Portraits from the Trench. I'm so excited to be debuting this portrait series at CucubaNación in Mayagüez, my art space in Mayagüez, on June 1st. The opening is at 6 p.m. And just wanted to share how excited I am to finally, after that date, be able to start sharing more about this community that I'm a part of. Que no soy una sola gata loca haciendo esto. We are many. There are more of us. And it has been a complete honor to get some of the stories via conversations and interviews with folks, to paint images of these brilliant bioluminescent Boricuas, and to share some of their rematriation reflections, some of their rematriation journeys and little glimpses into those journeys, which I will be doing via all my platforms starting next month. So just wanted to share that. These first episodes have focused a lot on my own journey and my own thoughts, but I'm looking forward to broadening out to share the stuff that people have entrusted with me and get those folks to directly share their voices here on this podcast and in the other platforms. So thank you for listening in, celebrating anniversaries, celebrating arrivals, celebrating transformations. Welcome and thank you for being here. Saludos and welcome to the Rematriating Borikén Podcast, where we discuss the journey to the essence of these islands, this archipelago and her surrounding waters, the restoration of our essence before conquest and continued colonialism, the reclamation of our collective healing and liberation. I am Yasmín Hernández, creator of CucubaNación, artist, writer, activist, born and raised in Brooklyn, Rematriating Borikén. May 15, 2014, we left in twilight, silent and sleep-deprived, with babies and maletas, boarded a cab out of Brooklyn to Howard Beach, Queens to Kennedy. We arrived, baby boys still wrapped in long sleeves and fleece, running under a scorching sun without a welcome, no one waiting, waving at the airport, on another corner of this island, unfamiliar, unknown, no family faces smiling at the gate. New York gray, muted and cold, contrasting cerulean skies, blue-green seas scalding, compared to the frigid Rockaways. We drove in shock down a palm-lined shore, excited, anxious, invited, but unannounced, temporarily hosted, simultaneously unwelcomed, in a foreign house on my ancestral land, hopeful and innocent, unaware, unprepared, answering a call from an unidentified source, afraid but still obliging. On the morning of Thursday, May 15, 2014, 1 year after my pact with the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Vieques, we landed at Aguadillas Rafael Hernández Airport, showing our boarding passes to security. Back at Kennedy, the young woman sighed. Ay, yo soy de allá, de Aguadilla, no extraño tanto. Another sign when the airport security person is from the town you're arriving to. I prepared to step off the plane reborn. Instead, I died, reimplanted in the womb of wombs, my ancestral womb, the goddess land of Boriken, land where my ancestors, a spirit of blood, had been born, had suffered, struggled, loved, triumphed, land where my ancestors had died and revived, as would I. It feels nothing like repatriation. The lush hills of green falling to the sea are not my father's land. They are not the majestic mountains, arid and brown, nor dried plains contrasting against turquoise seas of the Caribbean South. Countless banana plants, infinite trees cradling the roads with their canopies, innumerable mangoes collecting at the roadside like fallen orange autumn leaves, rolling downhill in golden abundance. Fertile, wet, lush landscapes replaced as stacked stairwells, tin roofs of wooden houses piled high in the shadow of Ponce's La Cruceta childhood memories. The massive island rock of the Suchil rising from the Mona Passage to the west is not the coffin-shaped island Caja de Muertos that rises from the Caribbean. The white North American expats in Rincon and Aguadilla, salty, sand-crusted and barefoot on the street, are not the black and brown Ponce skin of my family. The reggae played for tourists at Steps Beach is not a salsa Sunday at Caña Gorda on the southern shore of Guanica. Where am I? What is this place I've returned to but have never been? This is not my home. I might as well have arrived on another unfamiliar island. Together, we start anew in a place unfamiliar. I only recognize the song of cookies. Here lies permanence, where all things are fleeting, where the one-way ticket to a vacation that never was. The arrival of your luggage is uncertain. Your past was either tossed, packed, shipped, left behind, stolen, or lost. You only carry what is in your hands, where your passport has been issued by a foreign country who bore witness to your birth but whose nationality you can never claim, where you study that photo to remember who you were because you no longer recognize her in the mirror, where you fight off fits of exhaustive exile rage from wear and tear and endless years of unrewarding wrong side of El Charco work. Here you are forced to decide between earth and cement, between GMIs and what you have planted, sown, and grown, where you choose between living others' lives as told through social media touchscreens or breathing the breath of babies while dancing to nighttime serenades of wildlife. Here is where makeup less the sun paints you in colors of yourself, where you are forced to confront your veil. Dig deep, find and be authenticity, where the only enemy is the mosquito you smashed against the mirror, which now bears your coconut oil, shea, and cocoa butter handprint from a sister friend's going away gift. Here's where you dissolve the facade, and for all the blows your temple took, you let your spirit shine resplendent no matter what body it was born into. Here is where invisibility is no longer an option. Here is where you complete what you came to do. Journal entry, June 2nd, 2014, 2 weeks in. People don't always talk about that moment of arrival and what that is like. You know, I'm curious at this point of just even knowing the day, the actual date that folks arrived. What is that anniversary that needs to be recognized, that needs to be celebrated and applauded? What I share here and a practice that I have had since before I started painting. I started painting at 13 years old, started studying art at 14, but when I was a child, years before that, my medicine was journaling. That is how I made sense of myself and of the world. My paintings normally would be about more political and social criticism type stuff or different external themes that I was exploring in the world. But for a long time, journaling was the way que yo bregaba lo mío. It was very introspective, private practice. And so when I moved here, I stopped painting for some time because of various reasons, and money and access being one of those things. So what I love about writing when I was living in New York City is that you can have, like, I would be, okay, let me say this. I would be on riding the subway in New York y de momento me llegaba un poema in full body mode. A poem would appear in my brain, and I would be like in the middle of the train, standing, holding onto the pole or whatever. This is a download. What are we going to do with it? And I would bust out like a servilleta, a napkin, and like a pencil or pen from my bag and jot it down. I had to, because if I couldn't at that moment, I would lose it, right? And I've always loved that accessibility that writing would bring, and that sort of channeling. Writing was always just very much a personal process. So when I arrived, journaling was everything that I had. Most of my family is living in the States. It took for me to come here to realize that. So my mom doesn't have direct ties to her family here. And all of her family that we communicate with is in New York. Most of them. My father's family that is here is between Ponce and the area closer headed towards Área Metro. And so there was no immediate family here for us in El Oeste. Like if I wanted to see family, it was driving in one direction an hour and a half, or driving 2 hours in another direction. What I did was write every day, every day. That's how it was. And so what I share and what I've been sharing in some of the previous episodes have been some of those entries, some of those things either started as journal entries or became written pieces that developed from journal entries. Like the account of May 15 or boarding that plane and stuff, like that was written in retrospect and me reminiscing on that. But like the whole thing about here lies permanence, where all things are fleeting, that whole thing, that was like, sometimes I would be on the hamaca and just write the experience as I was living it, because I needed to make sense of it. There's a line in there about the cocoa butter, shea, coconut oil, shea butter, cocoa butter handprint. And that was accurate, right? That was my sister friend Sibel, who I went to high school with, who I went to Cornell with. We were both art students at Cornell together. Still a very dear friend. And as a going away gift, she had actually traveled to New York to say goodbye, which was so beautiful. And she brought this mason jar with this homemade body butter that she had done. And I used to like shower and slather that on myself, because it felt like very little self-care that I had access to in those early days. And I remember that actual scene of, having been stung by a mosquito and seeing homeboy like parked on the mirror y metiéndole un manoplazo as I was like putting this stuff on and leaving the handprint, like the buttery handprint on the mirror. And so those moments would make it into those poems or into those journal entries to encapsulate what those cuckoo early moments were. And to elaborate on what the poem stated, we arrived on May 15, 2014 to Aguadilla. I had been to El Oeste 2 times before with Ivan, and it is not a part of the archipelago that I was familiar with at all, other than those 2 trips. And when I say those 2 trips, they had been spaced out. One was, I think the first time we came to the area was Isabela, and on a trip in like 2003, and then another trip in 2011 where we stayed in Aguada. And that one was that we came for a wedding, a friend's wedding. And those were our 2 experiences with El Oeste. The contrast being that it felt so different than my childhood visits to Ponce. I did not grow up with the privilege that we came here often. And I came here, the first time I came here on my own without family was at 19 for spring break with Ivan. At that point, that was my 4th trip to Puerto Rico, right? In those 2 decades of my life. So I had traveled here at 3 years old, at 10 years old, at 12 years old, and then at 19. I think that it was close to another decade before I started traveling here again. It felt like I needed to come here constantly because I was making up for lost time. My relationship to this place was those family snapshots that existed in my memory. And for a lot of us not born and raised here, that is the sort of fantasy of what we have to connect us to this place. So speaking to arriving, no encajando, not fitting in, for a long time. It takes years for something to be triggered to say, I've arrived. And I realize I've had those moments 2 times here. Time number 1 was my birthday 2 years ago, where I wanted to see the sea and see this coastline from the seaside. And Ivan had asked what I wanted to do, and I said, I want to see esta bahía, right, between, say, Aguadilla, Aguada, Rincon. I would love to see it from the sea, like our ancestors would go, like being in a canoa or, arriving to it from that vantage point. And so we did that, and that's a whole long story for another time. But there's like interception. This is how this works. I start talking about one thing, and like all these memories and connections and meanings and significances start to intercept and weave all sorts of webs or constellations of connectivity. When we start to approach this point called Punta Boriken, which is, for me, I believe it is, right? There's no physical, La Isla Grande no es un rectángulo como tal. It kind of is, but it's not exactly. There's no right angle determining that northwest corner. And for these 10 years, I have lived here in el noroeste. But my understanding, studying maps as much as possible, is that Punta Boriken, for me, is what I consider to be la esquina de esta esquina. Y ahí está playa, Punta Boriken, and there's an incredible cliff. There's something about that corner that I feel myself drawn to and always want to come back to. And so the interception that I had a minute ago is that long before I moved here and long before I even had visited Isabela or this corner of the island, I had a dream that I was flying over the north coast of Boriken. And I knew that it was the north coast because me estaba orientando y yo podía ver, como yo estaba sobrevolando, yo podía ver la esquina. I could see where the coast turned. I could see the coast, I could see the surf, I could see the sand, and then I could see that there was a corner and then it went down to the left. And so I understood that I was flying over the north coast and approaching where the western coast was. And in this dream, as I'm flying above it, I can see Yucayeques down beneath, and I could see children running on the coast, and I could see women gathered around fires cooking. And I could see bohíos, and I saw it clearly, and I knew that I was seeing this corner. And at that time, I had never visited this corner. And so as I'm trying to talk about Punta Boriken in this moment of arrival for me, the dream intercepted, like, yo, talk about me. Remember this dream you had? Pues ahí lo dije. Y yo no quería como una gira. I didn't want like a tour per se. I was like, yo, get like un pescador de Aguadilla, and that's how we're going to do this. Like, alguien que sabe. Y de hecho, what happened on that trip? Like, another interception. He took us to La Cueva de la Golondrina and explained to us, and we were able to see the cave and how it kind of cantilevers above the water. And he explained that it goes 100 feet deep under that cliff. This is the Campamento Pelícano in Aguadilla that is known for being a center of the pelican community of Del Oeste, right? That is where they go. And as this fisherman explained to us, that is where they breed. That is where they breed. That is where they raise their young until they're mature enough to fly up and down the coast. If you ever go to any beach in Aguadilla, you know that I was going to say pterodactyls, porque yo me río, que they're like completely, they look just like pterodactyls, man. Those are like the descendants of the pterodactyls. I kid you not, these pelicans. But they're fascinating creatures. And so today, the reason why a Campamento Pelícano had to happen is that there is a development called the cliff that has destroyed much of this natural reserve that is actually the pelican's habitat. And so I had to mention that because we passed that on the way up to Punta Borinquen. La cosa que as you're passing La Cueva de la Golondrina, which is crystalline water, like emerald, turquoise, crystalline water, spectacular, with all these boulders. And de hecho, that development, that construction site, will leak all sorts of like flow from dirt and whatever crap coming out of the construction site, that those waters be muddy way too often, right? So those are some of the injustices that we're seeing here today. There's caves and aquifers within that cliff that supposedly, according to Puerto Rico law, should be protected, and those laws are not being enforced to protect this environment. As we are approaching, we keep going north. I'm back to my boat trip now. 2 years ago on my birthday, I know I'm taking y'all on a whole journey. As we approach Punta Borinquen, the water changes, it gets choppier. It's not that calm water that you see around the Cueva de Golondrina in La Bahía de Aguadilla. Now it's turning into more open sea. This boat is now going up and slamming on the waves, and I see the cliff. When I see the cliff, se me pega un llanto. My tears are just rolling down my face, rolling down my face, rolling down my face. And my lips start moving. I'm home, mama, I'm home. I repeat that like somebody had taken over my mouth, and my mouth just starts speaking on its own. And I was like, what the hell is that? Que si I'm home. Yo no vivo aquí. Yo no vivo en esta playa de Punta Borinquen and this cliff. And it was my birthday like 8 years after I had arrived, and I couldn't understand. It was more like 7 years. It was my 7th birthday here. I couldn't understand why I had that almost involuntary reaction. And I realized that it felt like there was something between that dream that I had of flying over Noroeste. Something in my spirit recognized that moment coming through on the water side, como se me había ocurrido que yo quería pasar mi cumple de esa manera. That approaching that cliff, I made this proclamation to this island. I'm home, mama, I'm home. I don't know who that was, or that was me, but that's what happened. I should share that last week for our anniversary at Punta Borinquen, I had this realization, and that is that the arrival is not a singular event. You don't just show up, step off the plane, and you arrived, and here you are. Es un proceso que ocurre como en capa, right? It's a layered process. You arrive in stages. And so early on, when I had first arrived, I would talk about feeling disjointed, feeling like, this was the analogy I would use, that my body had blasted off into space, but my spirit stayed behind, or vice versa, that the spirit blasted out into space and the body stayed behind. Like, because I felt that those two things had become separated in coming here, I didn't feel whole. And yet I would talk about coming here as a process of feeling whole, and then arrived and was feeling hella disconnected from my own self. The idea of arrival and having these moments that I can say, and this is a term that we use, oh, I've arrived. You've arrived. You've officially arrived, right? Like, we've talked about that. Something that we might say loosely. And I had this idea crystallize in my mind on my anniversary last week. 10 whole years to figure this out, that I've been arriving little by little. And so these events like Punta Boriken and some experiences that I had this month as part of my 10-year anniversary feel like this completion, like a circle of arrival. If that process took me a whole 10 years, there was something completed in that circle. And it's interesting because in the painting and the image that I include on the slide, on the slate for this podcast, and that's a painting representing, it's called I Come From Life. It's a title that comes from something my youngest used to say when he was a toddler. And you would ask him, where do you come from? Because he was always saying things that seemed to come from another place. Like, we're not of Earth, or we're not of a 3-year-old child. And I'd be like, man, where'd you get that from? Where did you come from? And he'd say, I come from life. And so that's the title of that piece. And it's us stepping, it's an image of me with my 2 children at the ages they were when we arrived. And the idea is that we're walking in these concentric circles in front of us. My friend Ty had called it a portal. She was like, yo, you're walking into a portal. But the way that I painted it was, I do reference concentric circles as a symbol being indigenous to this island, but also representing sonar underwater, representing seismic waves. And that's when that was the first painting I did inspired by the Puerto Rico Trench. And then it turns out that was May 15, 2015, when we had our 5-year anniversary. And then later that year in September, there was an earthquake. And then on September 23rd, Grito de Lares. And then that December was when the earthquake swarm began. So in feeling aesthetically called to the trench, and a site at the Puerto Rico Trench in the Mona Canyon, which is the epicenter of the 1918 earthquake, it was almost this call to know this part of the abyss, and to know where this seismic, or a part of where this seismic activity originates from, to know this island beyond the confines of this island, and to fully recognize it as an archipelago, what means to know it beyond Isla Grande, Vieques, y Culebra, know its smaller islands like Desecheo, Caja de Muerto to the south of my, parents' birthplace of Ponce. It means not just knowing los callitos que hay por ahí, right? Tantos callos que hay, like off the coast of Fajardo and off the coast of Vieques y Culebra and so many other places. It's knowing the waters, knowing the abyss, and knowing that is this sort of archipelagic identity, like seeing ourselves. Small countries that are archipelagos know themselves beyond the islands. And there is a political effort to claim their maritime space, right? Because the way that colonialism and imperialism works is by treating everything as diminutives, because if you could convince folks and people in countries that they're nations, that they're smaller than they believe themselves to be, then you also convince the world that they need a protector, or they need a big, strong power to come in there. And so that idea of a nation that is an archipelago functioning in a way where it extends beyond the land. The waters don't divide the islands. The waters are the bridges and the connection from island to island, just like El Charco could be and should be the expansive connectivity between this archipelago and the expansive diáspora. And in that case, no hay un solo charco, son muchos charcos, porque la diáspora extiende por todas partes, right? That everybody says la diáspora, and only talks about the United States, pero hay boricuas por todo el mundo. We must remember that. Me desvié. I was talking about arriving in layers. But it's almost like those same layers is how, if you think that we can't just come here and hit the ground running, it doesn't work like that. There's this whole process like of detox that we must undergo, a decolonial process, which I believe to be a lifelong process, but that too happens in stages. And as you shed those elements of like the lens of the colonizer and seeing things through the lens of the colonizer and what are those amenities we have and don't have. Oh, but in New York, it's like this. Oh, but when I go to the doctor in New York, they do that. Oh, but when I go to a restaurant in New York, I don't have to wait, this long to be seated. And all of these things that we sometimes hear folks coming from the diaspora saying. And that includes those of us visiting and those of us who move. And then get frustrated porque las cosas no son igual. What do you mean there's no water? What do you mean there's no light? And so those resistances can hinder the process of arrival. Because if you arrive and expect to find a state here, muérete, or like New York here or Florida here, then you have fully blocked your process of arrival. You've arrived to the wrong place and you got to go back if what you expect to find is what the hell you left. And so as we go through this detox from where we came from, y todas las malas mañas that we picked up over there or whatever, then it takes time to fully ground, to fully immerse. I talked in an earlier podcast episode, I was told that it would take you the hardest year is the first year. You make it through the first year, you're going to say, but it's going to take 3 years to ground. My friend Wanda told me that the first year, Wanda, who came here from Chicago. And so if it takes 3 years to ground fully, or to start to ground, it takes 3 years to start feeling grounded, is what she said, then it takes years. Encajar, ese proceso de encajar. I want to talk about this in future episodes, the abundance and the beauty and the wisdom behind so many of the quotes. So my friend Marisol, for example, who talks about, and she's been here for years, Hurricane Maria, giving her the permission and allowing her to finally feel esa pertenencia, that sense of belonging. And also going back when I talked about looking at the space with a colonizer lens, or not being able to fully arrive because you're still expecting the amenities from over there. And it's a little tricky. That's another, that deserves a whole episode unto itself, because there is a perspective that, folks who come here from outside bring, where they have seen or been exposed to things happening differently, y que hay ciertas cosas aquí que sí joden y fastidian, como tienen todo sitio. But the way that Javolo, another person who I interviewed, he talked about a friend or somebody who called it, la mediocridad I think is the word, the mediocrity. That sometimes there's this way that living in this colony, in this case, that's the correct term to use for this context. Living in this colony conditions you to accept certain mediocrities, like the shitty situation of our medical system, those kinds of things, right? So it's not a blanketed statement. It's not to say that when we come here, we can't observe or we can't recognize when things go awry or where things function in ways that severely need to be improved, like the light grid, right? So yeah, I don't want to make it an absolute thing. Everything discussed here has its perspectives and its different scenarios, but all that to say that arriving is not showing up one day and being like, I'm here, bitches. Es algo que es un proceso. Es un largo proceso. And when you have those moments that, I've arrived, and you might have that moment like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, but there's something about the moment that there's an affirmation to it. There's like a spiritual nod. Que te avisa, like, yo, welcome. You've ascended to the next escala. You've ascended to the next step of the ladder, right? And that's how the arrival is. It's always a journey. It's always a journey. It's not like saqué el pasaje, llegué y estoy. Maybe it could be that. I realize there's a lot more conversations that need to happen around rematriating Borikén and what that process is here and the wide array of what that looks like here. But I recognize that in this idea of arriving in layers may speak more directly to those of us who are arriving to live for the first time. I'm not sure enough, and I got to ask this question more of the folks that I've been speaking with that were born and raised here, that left, that came back, if they feel the same way, if after returning they go through this sort of like initiation process, this layered process of feeling arrived, fully grounded, fully immersed, and then the sense of belonging. I do know one person that I spoke with, Jari, did speak to having been raised here and having spent significant time going back and forth her whole life. But once she returned from a long stay in New York, still feeling sometimes that weird sense of, not of unbelonging, but feeling different and feeling perhaps othered by other folks. So future episodes, I will share more of what folks are sharing with me in their own voices. The next arrival story, and most recent, is from this May, when I participated in the event that Melanie Maldonado with her organization Toropa, en colaboration con la Casa de Arte y Cultura de Playa de Ponce, con Diógenes Ballester, I should say, in Playa de Ponce, the Caribbean Cultural Center, collaborated to put together this beautiful event, the second event to honor in Puerto Rico ancestors forcibly brought here. Because Melanie has worked on my genealogy, and because she has in particular worked on the line of my abuela, Nicolasa Ballester, in Playa, who was born in Playa de Ponce, she invited me to participate in this activity as a nieta, as she called it, de playa. And it was something that just felt too large for me to take on. So I was like, no, can't. this shouldn't be me. It should be someone from that community. And then she like reiterated the ask, and I had this sense at the moment that it wasn't just coming from Melanie. It just felt there's other ways, and this will be a future conversation with her. There have been other ways in which Melanie's work in genealogy and resurrecting information about ancestors suppressed and hidden is a way that it becomes a form of channeling. It has felt for me like a communication even from my ancestors, which I have had in other spiritual ways. It was an honor to go and participate and honor these 8 ancestors that were brought in through the port of Ponce in 1818 on a Portuguese slaver ship known as the Maria, from the island Sao Tome y Príncipe off the coast of Equatorial Africa, West Africa. And before that event, before that ceremony, I arrived there with bird of paradise flowers, which were my grandmother's favorite flowers. I arrived at Playa de Ponce earlier to take those flowers to the water because my abuela's father, my great-grandfather, was a fisherman who worked on those waters on the Caribbean off the coast of Playa de Ponce, and unfortunately passed away on his lancha on those waters. And so I took these flowers to them in their honor. I used to, with mommy, we would take, this is in East New York, Brooklyn. This is the house that she and my grandfather had in East New York, Brooklyn. And we used to go every Mother's Day, every birthday, which is also May. So this event that Melanie did was May 4. My grandmother's birthday was May 12. The anniversary of her passing is coming up on May 31st, pardon. And in between all this, we had Mother's Day. We would always go there for Mother's Day, her birthday, and take her birds of paradise. Melanie put together a beautiful altar. Folks gathered to do this. I was able to see Melody from the Caribbean Cultural Center, who I hadn't seen since before I left New York. And she helped put together this infinity symbol of white flowers. And within the 2 spaces of that giant infinity symbol of white flowers, they pinned up photos of different Afro-Boricua ancestors of Ponce. And so I took some photos of known Afro-Boricua ancestors de Ponce, like Pedro Albizu Campos, Isabela la Negra, which my father always talked to me about. And also Pedro Pietri, the Eureka poet, was also, there's a story there that Papoleto tells, and I don't know if that story was that that he's like a descendant or related. Había algo entre Pedro Pietri y ella. Y Dominga de la Cruz, who rescued the Puerto Rican flag when it fell to the ground during the Masacre de Ponce. And then I also pinned the photo of my grandmother. It's another Afro-Boricua ancestor. And Melanie had a plan that a beleng would be played. A beleng is a funerary bomba ritual. As I was pinning my abuela's photo, ahí fue que los tambores empezaron. Somehow I felt alone in that moment. Like everybody was in the area of the space, en el batey, I should say, con los tambores. Y yo estaba fuera en la calle, frente al altar. I didn't realize that Bárbara Abadia Rexach was an Afro-Boricua scholar, now working in California, was there, and she took these photos of that moment that I had that I didn't even realize she was documenting, and was so grateful to receive the photos the next day that she sent them to me. And it means so much that she documented that moment, because it was such a special moment for me in that day. Because when I put my grandmother, her image up on that wall, or on that, within that altar with these other ancestors, and within this greater ceremony in honor of these unknown ancestors, and this work Melanie does of resurrecting these stories, these legacies, so that descendants can remember. Like so many unnamed ancestors that we have. When she did it last year in Humacao, there was a registry of those names. I believe it was around 80 people brought through Humacao. But that moment, for me, kind of, it was like coalesced with what had happened before when I took the flowers and put them on the water. It felt like I had brought my grandmother back home, like a rematriation of my ancestra, of my abuela, which in turn felt like an arrival for me. And I realized that 10 years in, being called to Playa de Ponce, where my abuela was born, where these Paltera ancestras lived and worked their birthing work, that it, unbeknownst to me, I lived in their legacy by birthing at home in New York City. And it literally felt like a full circle, or a closing of a circle, of being called home by my ancestras, who I've been speaking of. I posted a rematriation video earlier this year, and it was about la ancestra, of those parteras who ensured our survival past genocide. And there have been so many times in the last year that I'm talking about these ancestras, and it literally felt like an acknowledgement. It felt like we see you, we see you, ven pa acá. And it just, the sense that I got when that call with Melanie, was like, no, I'm not the person for this. I don't have a direct tie to Playa de Ponce. I don't live there. I've never lived there. On May 4th, 2024, 10 years after arriving physically, felt like a full spiritual arrival. It felt like the full witnessing of that arrival. And it's just another download right now that I never thought of before, que estas ancestras de Playa de Ponce, que eran parteras quizá. I always talk about coming here as re-entering the womb and just questioning, okay, when is this rebirth going to be? I think that was it. I think that was my arrival. This, no sé, symbolic, spiritual, energetic calling from my ancestors. This witnessing, this bearing witness to my arrival, to my journey. Maybe they called me back. Maybe I have finally seen the rebirth that I thought would have occurred when I arrived on the plane that day 10 years ago, before realizing that I went right back into the womb to gestate again, not to be reborn. I think that my abuelas mis ancestras parteras just caught me in their hands. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Rematriating Borikén Podcast. I am Yasmín Hernández. For more information on the project, you can visit rematriatingborikén.com and find us under that same name on Instagram and Facebook. You can also visit Yasmín Hernández art.com. And also for those who are in Puerto Rico, on June 1st, we open the Rematriating Borikén portrait series, the first phase of the project at CucubaNación, my art space / gallery in Mayagüez, calle San Vicente, 4 calle San Vicente del pueblo cacubano de Mayagüez. En el oeste, if you are around after June 1st, opening June 1st, 6 to 8 p.m. After that, look out on any of our platforms for updates on related events, beginning with the conversatorio or gallery talk with some of the folks featured in the portrait series on June 6th. That is a Thursday from 6 to 8 p.m. In June, I will also be adding more on the project and the portrait series to the rematriatingborikén.com website for those of you who are not in the Puerto Rico area. Also, I will be sharing much more on the different portraits and the different voices featured in this project. So stay tuned to hear more voices besides my own on the rematriation journey.